They have decided to launch attacks within the next 3 months on 2 countries in our region, on at least 2 countries. It is quite clear that all these games are aimed at saving the Zionist regime.
Who is the second one? Do you know in his mind? I don't know. I cannot explain him. I do not pretend to penetrate him. He said it while announcing that basically he's ready to certain kind of negotiations, while telling the world that we cannot coerce him through sanctions into negotiations. He's quite sophisticated but still bizarre character. I prefer not to judge him upon what he says, but upon what he is doing.
The Israeli defense minister in an exclusive interview here talking about what Iran's president said today. Let's bring in our panel about all of this. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. Juan Williams, news analyst for National Public Radio, and syndicated columnist Charles Crowder. Charles, first an overview, what you thought of that interview and what reading between the lines.
I thought the most important statement that you got from the Minister of Defense was that kind of offhanded, semi-tongue-in-cheek, who's the second country? After all, Barak is the guy in charge of the planning for any attack on Iran, so he would know who the first is, and that was somewhat of a hint that Israel is quite serious about acting if it has to in the long run. The other really puzzling and interesting thing was what the president of Iran said, where he said Israel is preparing to attack within 3 months 2 countries. I read that as Lebanon and Syria, which would precipitate a regional war in which Iran would come in. And I'm reminded of the fact that the 1967 war began. That was June 67. It began, the train of events that led into it began when the Soviet Union falsely told Syria that Israel was planning an attack. It set in train a set of events, the mobilization of Arab armies, military pacts between them and the blockade of Israel that ultimately led to the outbreak of war. So this kind of rumors or threats of an Israeli attack on Syria is serious business. I'm sure it's absolutely false. There's no evidence whatsoever. It's not in Israel's interest to attack Syria and Lebanon. However, Iran, now under the pressure of sanctions, unilateral American, EU, and Canadian, feeling internal pressure and also even a scolding from the Russians, and even hints out of Washington that it's reconsidering its opposition to a military option. All of that, I think, is leading Iran into making these kinds of war-threatening statements. It's as if he's threatening Israel, if you do anything, we can start a war by using Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, and that would be a regional war that you would regret. I think that's his message.
Juan, in the same breath, in this interview, Ahmadinejad said that it makes no sense for the world leaders to go after Iran with sanctions, but then said, we're ready for new talks without preconditions. So, I mean, the mixed message out of Tehran is really something.
Well, and I think all you're seeing there is he's dragging it out. And that's a typical negotiating strategy for someone who really has no positive end in sight. I mean, does not intend that there would be a successful conclusion, just wants more time. And time for what? In this case, we know for what? To develop nuclear weapons. I think the difference is that he is speaking to sanctions, and speaking to sanctions in the aftermath of the actions by the European Union and the Canadians, the U.S. ratcheting up its sanctions unilaterally. My sense is that this is putting pressure, especially on the elites inside Iran, and possibly fomenting the kind of dissent that we saw come to a head last year, when you had, of course, the famous situation where the people were literally at the doorstep and then having to be rebuffed by the military elites.
Steve, what about the Israeli defense minister's response that he doesn't see, at least publicly saying, he doesn't see daylight between the Israeli government and the Obama administration about trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
Well, I think he has to say that. But there is actually some similarity in the messages. I mean, if you listen to what he said when you asked about, Ahmadinejad saying he was willing to negotiate again, he said, no, we need to see a change of behavior. You now have the Obama administration saying the same thing, and in discussions I've had with people in the Obama administration who are making policy, working on Iran policy, they will say the same thing. We now need to see a change in behavior. And I think it's a striking change in tone from the Obama administration that goes along with what you've seen from people that the Obama administration talked to regularly. Joe Klein from Time magazine has been quite critical of anybody who's even raised the possibility of a U.S. or Israeli strike on Iran, on its nuclear facilities. Wrote an article last last week in which he talked about the military option being back on the table. There was a Politico article that said the same thing. Now, I suspect that this is the Obama administration finally understanding, late in my view, that in order to have successful diplomacy with Iran, you need a credible threat of force. And we haven't had that, both in our public messaging and in our behind-the-scenes messaging.
This comes, Steve, as the WikiLeaks story continues, and also documents in there, in the 91,000 documents, saying that Iran is actively supporting the Taliban inside Afghanistan. Yet the president today said there's really no news in any of this release.
Well, I think in one sense he's literally correct. I mean, we've known what they've been doing. We've heard this. We haven't heard it with this kind of specificity from documents. We haven't seen these kind of documents, but we've seen numerous news reports. Jennifer Griffin had one last year that was a fantastic report about weapons caches that have been found. We've seen it in other news reports. You've seen administration officials, particularly uniformed military officials, talk about the support that Iran is giving to al-Qaeda and to the Taliban. And I think we've finally seen the end of this meme that Iran wouldn't support al-Qaeda and the Taliban because of religious or ideological differences. People have finally come to understand that that's just not how it works.
Charles, the Israeli defense minister cannot talk about timelines or the end of the line, and I cannot obviously get through an interview without asking that question. But what about that? Realistically, where are we?
I think if you listen to Israelis, you watch them, they'll never speak openly about this. But there's unanimity in the country. They cannot live under a regime where Iran controls a nuclear weapon because, A, it could be used for genocide. And the Iranians internally themselves have spoken about how there might be retaliation and damage to part of the Islamic world, but it would be nothing like what 1 or 2 or 3 nuclear explosions would do to Israel, would wipe it out, because it's a small country, small population. So there's a huge asymmetry here. It's not like deterrence in the U.S. and Soviet era. It's a completely asymmetrical situation. That means they are prepared. They will act. The only question is, will anything happen earlier to prevent that in order to make Iran disarm? Extremely unlikely. Will they get any help from the outside world? Extremely unlikely. But the most important, will they get a red light out of Washington or a yellow light? And no one knows.